to workshop. Just to give you all a brief introduction about myself, my name is Ishani and I'm currently a PhD student at Deakin Health Economics in Melbourne. We have with us today Professor Danny Liew, who will be presenting on leadership in the research environment, how to develop the leader in you. Professor Danny is the Deputy Head of School, Chair of Clinical Outcomes Research, and Co-Director of the Center of Cardiovascular Research and Education at the School of Public Health and Preventive Medicine. He is also a consultant physician at the Alfred Hospital in Clinical Pharmacology and General Medicine. Danny's research capacity and interests lie in clinical epidemiology, health services research, and health economics. His research productivity is highlighted by over 330 peer-reviewed journal articles, 9 book chapters, and over 10 million in NHMRC and ARC research funding. He is also an investigator in 2 CRC programs with funds in excess of $140 million. Danny is passionate about teaching as well and is involved in all levels from undergrad courses to postdoctoral fellowships. As testament to his clinical and academic leadership, Danny consults to both levels of Australian government as well as governments overseas and the healthcare industry. Thanks for being with us, Professor Danny, today. Before we begin, we would like to remind all the attendees with us today to use the Zoom's built-in chat function to ask any questions that you may have during the presentation, and we will reserve all the questions at the end of the presentation. Before any further delay, I would welcome Professor Danny from all of us to share the screen and begin the presentation.
Thank you very much, Ishani. I hope you're all well as we move down to another lockdown in Melbourne. I would like, if I may, to start my quick presentation by just acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and future. I'm very grateful to the committee for asking me to talk about this. I'm a bit embarrassed, honestly, because I'm not sure that I've talked much about leadership before, but anyhow, I'm going to give it a go and hope you find it sort of interesting and useful. So some disclosures, what I'm going to talk about is just leadership ideals, really. This is what I've been thinking about as I reflected on it earlier today, coming into this talk. But I fully admit that I'm actually far from ideal, still learning, in fact, very much so. And that I'm going to provide you personal views of my own, clearly, but none of it is evidence-based at all. I'm not sure, which is a very firm measure of metrics of successful leadership. I'm sure there are many, but we could look at it at so many angles. I had a look on Google. I Googled the term developing the leader in you and came up with a lot of books on this matter. There's 3 alone by Dale Carnegie. I think they're different sort of successive versions of it, sort of various forms. One for the data nerd here, one that involves you walking barefoot on hot coals, a more dreamy one, and then one for specifically for children. I think what this sort of highlights is that leadership courses are very common, as you probably know. I've been sent to many myself. And honestly, I think the utility of those for me personally has been actually meeting other people rather than learning too much about leadership, because there's a lot of sort of psychobabble in it. And I think I've done the Myers-Briggs personality test about 8 times already. But nonetheless, of course, it makes you sort of think and reflect about what good leadership is and who good leaders actually are. And as always, I've been influenced very luckily by people I've had the pleasure and fortune of working with and under. And so I've crafted my kind of thoughts around what I've observed from whom I think are very good leaders. I've split this into 2 parts. What constitutes a good leader at an individual level in terms of the traits and the characteristics of someone, and then subsequently in the second part about what makes a good team, what to look for as a good leader within the team that you are part of. So I think firstly, it's important to know yourself. And those of you who are familiar with this cartoon character, Po from Kung Fu Panda, hugely entertaining sort of cartoon series. And this very lovable character goes through all 3 of the episodes with some sort of identity crisis at some point or other. And he, at the end of it, sort of finds out and discovers who he is. And that's, I think, important for a leader in terms of you aspiring to be a leader, to know what are your values, what you hope to achieve, how are you going to measure success at the end of, when you lie in your deathbed, how would you actually say, I've actually been successful over time. So I think in research, there are two types of leaders generally, and I've highlighted two here from my own experience. The man on the left is a mentor of mine who's passed away a few years ago. His name is Henry Krum. He was one of the country's, if not the world's, most successful clinical trial list. So running clinical trials, he was a high sci academic, and I think he's still among the most highly cited at Monash University, despite that he's passed away about 5 years ago or 6 years ago. And he's a successful leader because he's really, really good at research, and he just needs to do what he keeps on doing really well and becomes an automatic leader. He's quite different from the lovely lady on the right-hand side, who's Christina Mitchell. She's our current Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, Nursing and Health Sciences at Monash Uni. And it's not to say she's not a good researcher, she is, but she's much more involved in the strategic direction of the faculty at Monash University and about planning and strategic directions, etc., very large groups. And I'm going to focus more on what Chris does rather than what Henry does, and for the rest of this talk. So in no particular order from now on, I think kind of topics or traits that I think, or knowledge pieces that I think are relevant for successful leaders. Mindful, I reiterate, this is just my own personal view. Firstly, I think it's important to realize that from now on, as a leader, it's about your team and not you. So that sounds very unselfish, but the reality is without people in your team, you can't be a leader anyway. So the focus needs to be on other people as a good leader. You've heard this before, no doubt, but people need to have a vision, some sort of idea of where they want to go. And I've said it many times before, what actually success looks like, both for you as an individual and yourself as a team or your team. And the visionary of my time in the sort of experience that I've had is this man. I think his name is John McNeil. He's recently retired from the head of School of Public Health and Preventive Medicine at Monash University. I've had the, again, pleasure of having trained under him for a very, very long time, since I was a first-year medical student. And he's an extraordinary visionary. I heard recently someone describe John as the Warren Buffett of research. And I thought about it and then quickly replied, no, I think that Warren Buffett is actually the John McNeil of investment. And John has this amazing sort of capacity to think about where he wants to go, where his department and school wants to go. And never leave me is a memory about sort of 15 years ago of his excitingly coming into the room that I was sharing with other people at the time and saying, guys, what's really important for the next few years is hospital safety. And at the time, it was completely unsexy, and then we kind of dismissed it and laughed at John, as we often did. But that's often to our peril, because lo and behold, a few years later, hospital safety became a really, really big thing. And I could go on and on about how John had the incredible capacity to see what was important for the future, and he's a great example of it. And you need to then mobilize people in your team to share that same vision. So to galvanize them, inspire them, motivate them clearly. And you've heard that before. That's easily said than done. The question is, how would you then do it? And these are kind of some of the thoughts that I've prioritized in terms of my observing people like John and Henry and Chris over many, many years about what they do and what I think has made them successful. Communication is critically important, especially in times of uncertainty. Dan Andrews, I think, is an excellent communicator, our Premier in Victoria. I don't necessarily think he's great in terms of the decisions that he makes or the policies that he affects, but he's an incredible communicator. I think it's important, especially if the team is small, but even if your teams are big, to be very compassionate and to have a personality that is approachable, affable, relatable. As you've heard before, no doubt, that EQ probably trumps IQ, I think, in terms of people's success, including in the academic environment. You have to have courage of your convictions, courage to make decisions that are not necessarily going to be popular or easy. And I've observed many, many times leaders who are not good because they were hampered or paralyzed by indecision because of the fear of what the consequences were and would be. And people avoid conflict. I understand that. Everybody sort of doesn't like conflict. But at the end of the day, one has to have the courage and the conviction to do what that person thinks is right for his group or his team or her team, etc. And as you've heard again before, actions are much stronger than words, as always. The other aspect that I think is really important, as a trait important in a leader, is authenticity. And I don't probably need to say much more than this, other than that you are probably aware that it's very easy to spot someone who's not authentic and therefore can't relate or respect that person, and automatically will render that person not someone you would like to agree with or follow or listen to. And then consistency is really important, especially in times of uncertainty. And over any period of time, there's going to be almost always uncertainty, and the current pandemic has shown it clearly. And this is in this time that we look for consistency in good leaders. So it's not always going to be the right choices that people make, but it's going to be making some decision based on the best available information at the time and sticking to that course. And also at different points in time to be consistent in the way that you approach something and follow the same values, for example, because without stability and that predictability, I think teams start to fracture, and that could really sort of cause disharmony and disunity among a group or within a group. And I think this is the last aspect that I have for as in terms of individual traits, is to draw inspiration and support from people and your surroundings where you can. I've illustrated at least three of my mentors over time, who I've been very, very lucky to have. But draw support and kind of inspiration also from colleagues and from students and consumers. I've used the word consumers there, whoever your consumer group is. For me, part of my work, my consumers includes patients. And I draw a lot of kind of inspiration and support from them in that they reflect back to me the success or otherwise of the work that I'm actually doing. Oh, this is one last one in terms of individual traits. It's an understanding of what the game actually is and where you want to, what you're navigating through, both in the long term, in the short term and the long term. So, for example, you're all aware that the research environment in terms of sort of competitive funding has now moved towards showing impact. So we no longer just say, I've published X number of papers, or indeed how many times my paper has been cited. But now what we, HMRC, MRFF kind of applications, you all know that you have to show that your work actually has translated to some sort of change to policy or practice or been implemented in some way. So understanding that kind of environment and how, and currently it's rapidly changing, as you know, is really critical. What the hazards are along the way, who are your allies, what are the kind of political tribes out there, and who are you going to sort of get on board as a collaborator as opposed to the competitor, etc. Ultimately, unfortunately, one has to have a lot of political nous to succeed, as a leader in any sort of a big organization. In terms of the team, some fairly straightforward sort of factors. It's the correct mix of people in terms of their composition, their skills, their personalities, their level of seniority, for example, and you want to assemble them so that you can achieve that goal in an efficient way. And this sort of group fellowship of the rings clearly needs some gender balance in there, but has the kind of right mix of it for the task that they were trying to achieve. And importantly, I try and understand and appreciate the personal goals. What is the driver for each person in my team, at least the group that I work closely with? I get an understanding as much as I can about what they want. And as far as I can support those people to achieve their goals. And most of the time they would align with the goals of the team anyway. Otherwise, you kind of selected the wrong person from the outset. It doesn't work all the time. And the team needs to be agile, look for opportunities, exploit them, and be active about them. So proactive rather than be reactive, and then resilience clearly as always. So well characterized, I think, by the Millennium Falcon in all these sort of three characteristics. And lastly, to keep learning and adapting over time. I think it would be a mistake for all of us or any of us to make if we were to think that we've reached the top and that there's no more to learn. I think that's a bit of a motherhood statement that's unnecessary to say, but you might maybe not be surprised at how stagnant people become once they reach a certain level, and then the world will just move on by them overall very quickly. I'm going to leave you guys as younger leaders than I am, or future leaders, with a challenge in terms of what your theme of your seminar series today actually is: preparing the health systems for the future. All of us have kind of visions and can imagine what the future looks like for healthcare, be it sort of robotics or information or data or technology. I challenge you to actually think about how we do prepare that. And I'm going to put forward to you what I think is going to be the future of healthcare. And it's not any of this. It's not actually technology driven. It's actually driven by consumer focus. And these are the company logos of very, very successful companies in the last 10 years, continue to be very successful. Netflix, Deliveroo, Uber, Airbnb, Amazon, Spotify, etc. And you think and stop and think about why these companies are super successful. They are game changing. They have been disruptive to the business of whatever they're actually in. And that is because they provide the service or the goods to the consumers at a time and a place that's convenient to them. So it's no longer about consumers traveling and being inconvenienced to go and get whatever they need. It's brought to them. And I think, honestly, healthcare, to succeed at the next level, needs to be adopting the same model, that we should be much more patient-focused, much more patient-centric or consumer-focused in terms of what we do. It's not about the technology. The technology is very useful, and it's been there for some time. It's about the mindset, it's about the governance, it's about the culture. And I think that's actually what would make healthcare successful in the future. And you guys in your position are lucky, because I think that you are skilled enough and have knowledgeable enough to be actually in a position to measure what this success looks like, which ultimately is patient satisfaction. And that's really all about outcomes research. So I'm going to stop there, everybody, and hope that you found that interesting.
Thank you, Professor Danny. This was really a wonderful presentation and completely took us away from a bit of academics and told us that it's more important to have, IQ is not only important, but EQ is equally important to be a good leader in this field. And thank you all to all the attendees for your participation. We have the discussion, we have some questions here. So what should we, Tan is saying, what should we be thinking about how, as a PhD or an early career researcher, how do we make ourselves stand out, particularly in a difficult research environment for research funding?
Yeah, good question, Tan. So as mentioned, research funding now is evolving towards an area of having people having to show impact, if not past history or track record of impact, but certainly something, the work that they do will have impact. And so it's articulating it in that way, making sure that there are systems and processes that for evaluating what that looks like. So measurements of success or metrics of success for impact. And it's, as you guys probably have done, you read a lot of applications from people, and they talk about sort of papers and the typical or usual traditional metrics, but then with impact, then they move on to other things, like how many times something's been mentioned in Twitter as a tweet or in guidelines, etc. So at least move to that. But I think, honestly, to move one step beyond is to actually imagine or put down on paper some sort of impact that translates to better patient outcomes. And I don't mean mortality or hospitalizations necessarily or costs. I mean their satisfaction. So you can kind of mention or articulate that in your application. That'd be good. Other practical things is to get into teams. It's difficult, as you all know, for younger people without track records to get a start. And so your kind of immersion in a team, that has got the heavyweights behind it, and then you sort of work your way up through that time. Hope that answers your question. I can see the next question, Ashani. I can read it if you like.
The next question is from Thao similarly. What channels can PhD students or early career researchers hone our leadership skills? How can we hone our leadership skills?
Yeah, so Thao, as mentioned, they are leadership courses, and that includes for aspiring leaders, including PhD students and early career research or mid-career research people. Most universities have these kind of courses that develop people, also have formal programs of mentorship. And, if you've not already been aware or been involved, certainly go and investigate that. But beyond this kind of formal things is to get one's hands dirty. So as a kind of more senior person, what I tell people that I look for when hiring other people, for jobs or to take on PhD students, is I look for hunger, gumption, if you like. Is that kind of fire in the belly that I know is going to drive people. So, I look for that. And welcome, I'm more likely to welcome those people to teams than not. So it's a kind of long about way of saying how that get involved, get into a team, get into collaborations, do some engagement work, sit on committees, and most of them, unfortunately, you might not be reimbursed for, but that's invaluable experience for you. And people take notice of those people, younger people who are hungry.
That's really informative, Danny. Thank you. We have another question from Sneha. What was your impression of the failed joint venture Haven that had the vision for the future of healthcare along with the individualistic principles and yet did not succeed?
So Sneha, I'm not aware of that particular venture, but and I'm not sure exactly what happened with that particular venture. But if you're talking about digital health or technology, and maybe I assume or data related, I can at least give you some sort of feedback into why historically we've not been successful in that. It's largely because we don't have the culture that accepts change very easily. And I'm a medical clinician, so put my hand up. The doctors are the least likely people or group of people to change ever. And also the issues that have been hampering it is, if it's data related, is data governance, data confidentiality, et cetera, et cetera. So that's been a continuous challenge. And a lot of people can't develop solutions and apps and things like that without an understanding of these critical issues that make them fail.
Yes, I hope that was helpful, Sneha. We have another question from Utsana. She says, thank you, Danny, for a nice overview of leadership. From my understanding, there are many types of leaderships. One thing that the leaders come across quite often is managing the conflict. It can be work or personal or conflicts within the team members. Is there any suggestions from your non-evidence-based view? Good question,
Yeah, thanks. It's a tough one. Certainly non-evidence based. It's personally based. May not surprise you guys. I deal with conflict just about every second day, and I find, to be honest, the tools that help me most is a kind of compassionate ear, kind of understanding of why someone's upset, and trying to get resolution for their specific issue. Very often it comes down to miscommunication, unmet expectations, etc., which tend to be the easier things to do. Other times, as you move along to sort of graded levels of difficulty, the most difficult ones, those very ingrained personalities, very difficult, very set in their ways, and I'm not going to change, etc. Tend to be sort of older people, well established, and honestly, ultimately, you try and reach a fair resolution, and if you don't, you make a decision that's actually best for the group or the school or the university, and there will be people sometimes who are just not going to be happy, unfortunately. But most of the time, I think compassion and a sympathetic sort of ear and some level-headedness and fairness gets you, most of the way. I don't see any more questions.
Yeah, I think we have these questions. It's open for discussion. If anyone wants to discuss anything, you can unmute and we can have a discussion. Or you can still post up your questions if there are any. I guess we don't have any more questions. This is a really interesting topic, Danny, again, and thank you for all the attendees for your participation. At the end of today's symposium, we will be sending out an evaluation form, and it would be greatly appreciated if you could fill this out. And now we have another session which starts in 5 minutes at around 1:25, which is the research spotlights. So I hope to see you all there. And thanks again, Danny. Thank you so much for this presentation.
Thank you, Ishani, and thank you, everyone. All the best to you. Stay safe.
Thanks, Danny.